Hello, and thank you everyone for joining. My name is Amelia Vance, and I'm really excited to be here talking today about the whirlwind that has been occurring at the federal level. So, while we specifically referenced Congress, we'll also dive a little bit into some other federal actions. Um, I am Amelia Vance. I am the president and founder of the Public Interest Privacy Center and the chief counsel of AASA, the School Superintendent Student and Child Privacy Center. And this is a joint webinar between our two organizations. After all of this, we'll go ahead and share our slides and the recordings. So know that that is coming soon to you. But we are very eager to get your questions. I won't promise I'll be able to answer them, especially as I feel like new bill text has been popping up every day. But I will do my best and share resources in chat. But let's go ahead and start today by talking about the why. So, why exactly is the federal landscape so active right now? Why does it feel like every time we turn around, there is a new privacy something out there? So, as you might imagine, as an expert on child and student privacy, my focus will be mostly in those areas. But of course, shockingly, children are people. And so anything that is introduced about consumer privacy in general, adult privacy, other things also affects kids. So we're going to be talking about some of those broader implications as well. So let's dive in. Why is it so busy? So I just pulled these. I think most of them are from the last week or two. um, a bunch of headlines, which shows how much we're seeing every day in the news accusations, allegations of exploitation of our data by tech companies and concerns about even some of the most sensitive data, things like HIV status, sexual orientation, our mental health information, what we share in dating apps. All of this is being collected and shared in ways that many of us never imagined. And so these are the sorts of things that are popping up. As I said, I think almost all of these headlines, except for one, is from the last 48 hours. So it genuinely is a nonstop deluge of concerns and worries and ways that we see as consumers that maybe we're not operating in a safe environment, in a trusting environment. And so this constant conversation is definitely affecting what is occurring at the federal level. In addition to these feelings, we're also worried about how other people, including the government, can purchase and use the data that tech companies have about us or data that they may have. So, again, just in the past couple of weeks, we saw stories about the privacy concerns, the Senate passing a spying bill, despite some of the worries that have been raised about intelligence officials purchasing our data from companies. Um, you have a law that just passed in Georgia that restricts credit card companies from labeling firearm purchases as firearm purchases. You have a new HIPAA rule that says that abortion related medical records cannot be used against patients. You have a company that provides automated license plate readers and other things and claims that it solves crimes. And it's using not only data from police departments that are using its software, but also maybe private businesses or others that have purchased the software, often in ways that aren't disclosed. So we have companies we're worried about, we have government, and we're also really worried about our children. There's been a nonstop series of headlines asking, how do we make mental health better? Because obviously there is a problem here. There are things that need to be done. There are specific examples and investigations, both from researchers and journalists, on things like online platforms where predatory groups are coercing children into self-harms, concerns about screen time, concerns about whether the safety measures any particular app has is sufficient, what social media and algorithms are doing to all of us, let alone to kids, and how even toys could raise concerns about our children's data and their well-being in ways that we might never have imagined. And if all of this wasn't enough, you also have new technologies raising new concerns. This is, again, very recent articles just from the past month or so that talks about, the data guzzling AI companies where they need more data than they actually have. And how can you stop your data from being used to train AI? And what are some of the privacy problems here? And a headline from just today about a art project that's launched that has a camera that strips away someone's clothing when it's used in an effort to educate people about the prevalence of deep fakes that are going around and being developed right now and the need to regulate there. So that's a lot of concerns. And then that in and of itself is paired with state action. So these headlines haven't gone unaddressed. In fact, you've seen multiple states passing multiple laws this year, last year, and previous years. I'm a particular fan of Hush Blackwell's fabulous ongoing privacy law maps. As I said, I will share the slides after this, and I have links to everything in there. But you have multiple states that have introduced and passed child-specific protections, multiple states that have now passed consumer privacy law protections, which also apply to children. I think we're up to 17. Might be 18 though, because I think another one just passed. And so you have all of this action going on at the states, but as always, states individually are doing their own thing and aren't necessarily aligned with the approaches that others are taking. And so for those who operate nationwide, for people who might live on the border of one of these states and have protections in one state but not in another, for companies that operate nationally and have to figure out compliance, there is a push to not only fix all of the problems that I just talked about, but also to figure out if there is any way to align these varying approaches and concerns into a federal standard. And so this is what we are looking at as we are looking at what Congress is doing, what is happening at the federal level. We're trying to deal with all of these variables. So with that, I'm going to start with the congressional Congress seeking to update a pretty old law, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, and talk about what's driving some of that particular law. So COPPA was passed about 24 years ago now. I'll specifically focus mainly on COPPA in the school context, because this is really where there's been some interesting things happening. So COPPA only applies to operators of commercial websites and online services, including mobile apps. The online site or service must be directed to children or have actual knowledge that children under 13 are using the site for the law to apply. And companies that are subject to COPPA must obtain parental consent before collecting personal information from children. However, in some circumstances, the school can consent. So you have this law that's been around forever. A core principle of it has been the verifiable parental consent process. So essentially, if a parent consents, a child can use an app. If they don't, they are out of luck unless the company is either collecting no information from them, something that's very difficult to do on the internet, or they are basically allowing the child to lie in order to get on it. And so this law has been around forever. It's often been found ineffective. You have countless research and stories about the number of kids who are being who are having to lie to get access to essential content, including content perhaps for their education and other issues. And the idea of just protecting the information of kids under the age of 13 and only protecting the information that comes from those children and not information about those children feels a little narrow, feels a little antiquated, perhaps, to many people, especially to parents. And so there's been a lot of action over the past several years trying to update what is in COPPA. So we've seen this most clearly with COPPA 2.0. This law was reintroduced. It had been introduced in previous Congresses by Senators Markey and Cassidy in May 2023, unanimously passed out of Senate Commerce, and had the ranking members and chair of Senate Commerce added on as co-sponsors just in February this year, with significantly updated text introduced. So highly recommend if you haven't looked at it in a while, or if you've only looked at the version on congress.gov, you should absolutely take a look at what is linked in the press releases. And then this month, the House companion to COPPA 2.0 was released. So what are some of the updates to COPPA? So COPPA 2.0 would expand the age of COPPA protections to 17. Parents would still own rights and be able to provide consent for children under 13, but teens, and also parents in most cases, would own the rights for teens themselves. So they could choose to consent or not consent to certain information being collected. There is a change to COPPA's knowledge standards. So previously, COPPA covered sites or services that had actual knowledge that they were being used by kids or were directed to kids. And this is expanding it a little broader because legislators haven't liked that companies could stick their heads in the sand and say, well, we don't know that the child named Amelia Vance is showing up. So we have no actual knowledge, and our site isn't meant for kids. In fact, we say in our privacy policy that if you're under 13, you can't use our site. So we're obviously not made for kids. But we've seen through a variety of Federal Trade Commission settlements and others that actually there are a lot of companies who know they may not know a particular child is on their website, but they know there are kids. They've told advertisers that they are commonly used by children, and therefore they should put their advertising dollars towards their site to advertise to kids. And so while the Federal Trade Commission has done a great job in its settlements in addressing some of these issues and ostrich-like behaviors, COPPA 2.0 would change the knowledge standard to actual knowledge or knowledge fairly implied on the basis of objective circumstances that a user is a child or a teen. It also does not permit collecting personal information in a manner that violates certain requirements. So operators must provide a clear and conspicuous notice of what info is collected, how it is used, disclosure practices, and you get new rights and opportunities, which must be disclosed to parents or teens. Operators also have to obtain consent before using or disclosing info for a purpose that would be a material change from the original purpose for which they obtained consent. It also prohibits individual specific advertising to children or teens, requires data minimization, and does not allow operators to retain information for longer than reasonably necessary. Some of the rights and opportunities provided for parents include describing the specific types of information collected from the child, how the operator obtained or will obtain the information, and the purposes for which they've obtained it. It allows parents to delete information at any time and refuse to permit further use or future online collection of information from that child. It provides for an opportunity to challenge accuracy and have inaccurate info corrected. And it also allows parents to obtain information collected from the child themselves. These rights and opportunities are mirrored with those that are now available for teens. It also requires operators to establish, implement, and maintain reasonable security practices, and operators cannot discontinue services after a deletion request if they are capable of providing their service without that information. So if you don't need the information in order to provide the service, then cannot stop someone from using that service. There are a lot of things that, a lot of open questions about exactly how all of this would play out. But I want to go back now and talk a little bit about COPPA in schools. So, up until now, the FTC has clearly stated on its website, FAQs, that schools can provide consent for data to be collected by an operator from a child. So when you are using a math app in class, the school is able to consent to that. This was based on slightly shaky legal ground. So, in the statement of basis and purpose to the 1999 COPPA rule, the FTC noted that the rule does not preclude schools from acting as intermediaries between operators and schools in the notice and consent process, or from serving as the parent's agent in the process. Stakeholders have been pushing the FTC to codify this guidance for many years, both in a 2017 workshop with the Department of Education and the FTC, and in comments requested by the FTC in 2019 on what changes should be made to the COPPA rule. So with COPPA 2.0, you have a pretty common sense fix. So, here we go. So, COPPA 2.0 has a school consent amendment. This is in both the Senate and the House version, and it specifically provides that verifiable parental consent is not required when the operator is acting under a written agreement with the educational agency or institution, but only if that written agreement requires the operator to limit its collection, use, and disclosure of personal information to solely educational purposes, provide the educational agency or institution with a notice of the types of personal information collected, the method by which the operator will obtain that information, and the purposes. So if this is starting to sound a little like those rights the parents are given, there's a reason for that. So making sure that there is no loophole that would allow companies to exploit this information without limitations. The schools can exercise a measure of control over the companies that they have a written agreement with. They must also provide the educational agency or institution with a link to the operator's online notice of information practices and provide the educational agency or institution with a means to review the personal information, to prevent further use or maintenance or future collection of personal information from a child or teen, and to delete personal information collected from a child or teen or content or information submitted by a child or teen to the operator's website, online service, online application, or mobile application. It also has some requirements for schools. So the written agreement has to say that whoever is signing it says that they have the authority to authorize collection, use, and disclosure of personal information from children or teens on behalf of the educational agency or institution. So you have to put your name down and say, I am authorized to contract on behalf of my school and turn over student information. So this is definitely stricter than current practice most of the time today. And then it also has specific obligations for educational agencies or institutions. They have to provide a notice that identifies the operator with which it has entered into a written agreement, provide the operator's notice regarding its information practices to the parent or to the teen. And then, upon request of parent or the child or the teen, request that the operator provide a means to review the personal information from the child or teen and provide the parent or the teen a means to review the personal information. So, all of the rights are maintained. To some extent, the status quo allowing schools to consent to the use of educational technology is maintained, but it actually introduces some stricter requirements than currently exist in federal law by specifying that there has to be a written agreement, that you have to have someone say they clearly have the authority in order to sign this written agreement, and in what schools will be required to put on their website or provide to parents. So, this is great. This amendment came in the February 15th draft of the Senate version of COPPA 2.0 that was put out. But there's something else that happened with COPPA this year that I think is worth mentioning, which is the COPPA NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So we're all very excited right before Christmas when the Federal Trade Commission announced a notice of proposed rulemaking. The notice was published in January and comments were due in March. And I think most of us expect to hear something probably in July or August this year, whether it is a final rule or it's going to take a little longer and we'll get back to you. There were, I think, 731 comments filed, and most of the ones that were filed generally felt that a new provision about school authorization was a good idea. So, very similar to COPPA 2.0, the COPPA Notice of Proposed Rulemaking proposed explicitly codifying the existing guidance of the FTC that permits schools to authorize the collection of personal information for educational purposes. And this is nearly identical to what is in the provision in COPPA 2.0 that I just went through. So, one way or another, whether COPPA 2.0 passes or the COPPA NPRM moves forward, it is 99% likely that this language is going to end up either in the rule or in the new statute. And so districts and others will be able to use this to make sure that they have that written agreement with these specific requirements in place moving forward when an app would otherwise require parental consent. The NPRM also included some other interesting things, such as potential impacts on the use of AI or on the use of personal information for training AI. But I'll hold on that because we spent a lot of time on COPPA now, and I think it's important that we move on to our next law. So, the Kids Online Safety Act. This has been the other major piece of legislation that has been moving. So the bill existed in the previous Congress, was reintroduced by Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn in May last year, unanimously passed out of Senate Commerce in July. In February, it was announced that the bill now had 63 co-sponsors. I think that's actually gone up a bit. So there is a filibuster-proof majority of the Senate that are co-sponsors, meaning that once it is put to the Senate floor for a vote, it will pass. There is updated text, significantly updated from that Senate version, which again is available if you go through the press releases on either Senator Blumenthal's or Senator Blackburn's web pages. And then on April 9th, along with COPPA 2.0, a House companion to KOSA was released. So, what are some key provisions of KOSA? So, it also goes up to age 17. And just to mention, most of the child privacy bills go up to age 16 or 17. So you have broader protections agreed across the board, bipartisan at the federal and state level. And so it's likely, no matter whether or not this passes or other things pass, that having those protections up to age 17 are going to be legally required. So it has that. It says that covered platforms have a duty of care to exercise reasonable care in creation and implementation of certain design features to prevent and mitigate specific harms, mental health disorders, patterns of use indicating or encouraging addiction-like behaviors. It also requires some safeguards for minors, parental tools, requires reporting mechanisms. Certain large platforms must provide public reports. There is research required on social media and minors that the FTC must commission, some guidance on market research, age verification studies, creating a kids online safety council, enforcement by the FTC, and then also an interesting secondary act, the Filter Bubble Transparency Act, which was added as an amendment at the July 2023 markup and actually applies to all services, not just those being used by minors. So, what are the issues when it comes to KOSA and schools? There's a couple concerns, very similar to COPPA 2.0. You run into issues when you have to get parents to consent. So, I think a great example of this that my boss always uses is, if there are four of us in a room and we're four kids, one of us maybe got our permission slip signed. One of us didn't get it signed because, the parent was running out the door to the other, to their siblings' soccer game. One of them, their parent works 4 different jobs and was not available to sign the permission slip. And with someone else, their parents happen to be abusive. And so they didn't even bring up with the parents whether they would sign a permission slip. Oftentimes, when consent is not gotten, it is not because parents have chosen to opt out of a particular technology. And so it becomes an equity issue to require that parents opt in to the use of this technology. There are also significant issues if parents are allowed to opt out. So, for example, you really don't want parents able to opt out to the school bus driver knowing certain medical information. Why? Because if your child is allergic to something, you want the bus driver to be able to respond and use an EpiPen to deal with an allergic reaction or things like that. There are all sorts of data sharing information that happens day to day in schools in order to make sure students are educated and safe. And having the ability to opt out of those particular data collection and sharing and storing in technology mechanisms would likely undercut a great deal of school administration, would cause teachers to have to create multiple different lesson plans or other things. So, all of this is very difficult. This is why you have in COPPA 2.0 and the COPPA NPRM an allowance for schools to consent, but making sure again that there aren't loopholes there, that there has to be this written agreement, that it has to comply with certain requirements, that the person who's signing the agreement has to actually have the legal authority to sign it. So, allowing for school consent in that narrow circumstance of the educational environment when safeguards are in place. So, with the Kids Online Safety Act, there are a couple areas where, because there isn't really a discussion of education technology specifically, you have certain tools that are given to parents. And this could end up interfering with contractual relationships between schools and ed tech vendors by requiring that parents have access to the settings of ed tech used in the classroom. I'm probably less concerned with parents having access than students gaining access and maybe deleting their attendance records so they don't get in trouble. But this is definitely an issue that could cause significant problems, especially because if you're able to change the settings, you're also able to sometimes expand the data that's being collected by a platform, undermining the privacy protections the school may have put in place. So you have that issue. You also have a concern around student opt outs of personalized learning. So essentially, there's a section of Kids Online Safety Act that allows students to opt out of opaque algorithms, or allows children to opt out of opaque algorithms, which is great, except that there may actually be algorithms that are being used for personalized learning, used as part of IEPs or other school functionality, where it is important to make sure that students can't opt out of, say, a personalized recommendation section or the use of an algorithm, because this is something that has been chosen by the school as part of the curricular experience of what is maybe required locally or at the state level. And it's important that that be maintained. So you have these two issues with the Kids Online Safety Act. There are other issues that folks have brought up. I will say that I'm actually not too concerned with those. There have been significant new language that has been put into the latest version that deals with a lot of the potential civil rights issues or, potential violations of, particularly marginalized students and all of this. And so the bill is actually in a good place. It's just, for the moment, has some issues for education stakeholders. I will flag that the House version of KOSA has some significant changes from the Senate version. It's much more specific about the companies that the law will cover and what is covered and what should be done and when and what is the threshold. So I highly encourage all of you to take a look at both the House and the Senate versions. Next up, we have the Americans Privacy Rights Act. So this is a comprehensive consumer privacy bill, well, a discussion draft at the moment, that came out by surprise on April 5th, 2024, when it was announced by Senator Cantwell and Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers. These are the chairs of the House and Senate Commerce Committees. That's a big deal. It means that it has not only bipartisan, but bicameral support and a likelihood of moving. The bill incorporates parts of the previously introduced, very popular Comprehensive Consumer Privacy Bill, ADPPA, as well as those state consumer privacy laws that I referenced earlier. So it's trying to create that national standard, including some preemption, which is certainly an issue that many people are concerned about. So the discussion draft received broad support from committee members in a House subcommittee hearing on Energy and Commerce Innovation, Data, and Commerce Subcommittee. Many members emphasized, though, that the law needs to include more protections specific to children. I would point you to the fact that this discussion draft was released on April 5th. And just a couple of days later, you had the Kids Online Safety Act and the COPPA 2.0 House versions introduced. So I'm less worried about child privacy provisions being eventually added to the American Privacy Rights Act, since I'm sure they didn't want to duplicate the bills. So with that in mind, it's likely we'll see significant child privacy provisions that are added in to future iterations of the discussion draft or eventually introduced bill. The overarching goal of this law is to supersede that patchwork of state laws and establish a unified national privacy standard, which is not something the US has done. So some of the covered entities here, you have not only companies swept in, but you also have nonprofit organizations. However, government entities, including school districts, are exempt, and entities acting as service providers to government entities, such as edtech providers, are also exempt. There are specific provisions around data minimization. So, data collection, processing, retention, and transferring is prohibited unless it is necessary, proportionate, and limited. And specifically, when it comes to schools, there's actually a mention of in the retention section the fact that a company may not want to, may not need to delete information if they are required to retain it for a school. The law also has consumer rights built in. You have a broad right to opt out of targeted advertising and data transfers, some requirements for impact assessments for larger companies, and then also data security provisions, transparency, dark patterns, prohibition on manipulative design, essentially, if they would try and manipulate someone into agreeing with something when they don't want to, or consenting to something when, if the deceptive design wasn't there, they would have not agreed to it. It also includes provisions related to algorithms. So platforms have to evaluate most algorithms to reduce the risk of harm, and consumers have to be given the right to opt out of using algorithms used to make certain consequential decisions related to, among other things, education enrollment or opportunity. As I mentioned, there are limited child-specific protections in APRA, which opens up the possibility of KOSA or COPPA 2.0 or sections of those making it into the bill. As I mentioned, government entities are exempt. The definition of sensitive data includes information about minors under the age of 17, and sensitive data requires additional protections under this bill. Opt-in consent is required before sensitive data can be transferred. Again, there must be impact assessments, including how the company will mitigate harms to minors. And again, mentioning that the algorithms have to give, companies have to give consumers the right to opt out of using algorithms used to make consequential decisions like education enrollment or opportunity. All of this feels like enough, doesn't it? Unfortunately, it is not. I think a good illustration of that is from the House hearing last week, where the American Privacy Rights Act was first discussed. You can see on this list of the legislative proposals they were discussing, there were a number of bills, including multiple children's bills, including Kids Online Safety Act, COPPA 2.0, that were discussed. So we've seen a ton showing up here. We also have the Eyes on the Board Act. We actually have a newer version, I think, floating around that hasn't been provided publicly yet. This is really noteworthy. It would prohibit schools that receive funding under E-rate or the Emergency Connectivity Fund from allowing access to a social media platform to students on any supported service, device, or network. However, the bill's definition of social media is pretty broad and may unintentionally encompass technologies used for collaborative learning. It also requires schools to adopt a screen time policy, including guidelines disaggregated by grade for number of hours and uses of screen time that may be assigned to students, whether during school hours or as homework. Schools have to certify compliance, and the FCC must then establish an easily accessible public database that contains each internet safety policy and screen time policy submitted. So many requirements on schools, and also a high likelihood that schools will feel compelled to do much more monitoring of their networks, of their devices, than they currently are. So some really tricky things there. And then Just recently, we also know that there are new updates to legislation from Senator Schatz to set social media age minimum, banning algorithmic targeting for users under 17. And it is just announced today, I believe, that there will be a markup which includes that particular bill next week. So we have that to look forward to from Congress, and we'll continue to see heavy activity in all of these areas in the next few months. So that's Congress. Let's also briefly talk about some federal executive actions related to AI. So, of course, not just AI is a focus from the White House. You also had in the 2024 State of the Union, third State of the Union in a row, that said that we need to pass legislation to protect kids, specifically phrasing this as passing bipartisan privacy legislation to protect our children online. Maybe a sign that the White House might support APRA if it has sufficient child privacy protections. But a couple of years ago, you also had the White House put forward a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And it said that there should be 5 core protections to which everyone in America should be entitled: safe and effective systems, algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, and alternative options. You also had several actions that were put forward. Shortly thereafter, well, about a year later, you had an AI executive order that was pushed forward, which included the requirement of an AI toolkit for education leaders. This is still forthcoming, but this includes specific guidance from the Department of Education about how to ensure appropriate human review of AI decisions, designing AI systems to enhance trust and safety, and align with privacy-related laws and regulations in the education context. You also had, in the executive order, an ask that independent regulatory authorities, such as the Federal Trade Commission, should be encouraged to consider using their full range of authorities to protect American consumers from fraud, discrimination, and threats to privacy, consider rulemaking, as well as emphasizing and clarifying where existing regulations and guidance apply to AI. So this is where we've now seen a number of executive agencies putting out statements, information, and guidance saying that even though AI, feels unprecedented and new and all of that, our existing laws do apply to it. You can't lie about what your product does. You can't say you do something on your site and not do it. You have to make sure that you're not violating civil rights laws or causing discrimination, even if it is only a disparate impact. And so many agencies are now putting out more and more here. So we had all of these federal actions related to AI and data sharing that have been coming out. There's many more I didn't include here. But most recently, and sort of the thing that I want to close out today with, is the OMB memorandum. So at the end of March, OMB put out a memo with the goals of strengthening AI governance, advancing responsible AI innovation, and managing risks from the use of AI. Now, the OMB has limited jurisdiction here. So it specifically deals with federal agencies that are relying on AI outputs to inform, influence, decide, or execute agency decisions or actions, which could undermine the efficacy, safety, equitableness, fairness, transparency, accountability, appropriateness, or lawfulness of such decisions or actions. So this is limited to those agencies. But as you'll see in a minute, that may not be as limited as as mentioned. And we've seen a lot of the various things that have been brought up by the federal government make their way down to what is happening at the state and local level. So, what else was in the OMB memorandum? Required strengthening of AI governance. Federal agencies will have chief AI officers and agency AI governance bodies. They'll have to have public compliance plans and publicly available AI use case inventories. They'll have to make sure that they're removing barriers to the responsible use of AI, such as sharing certain AI models more broadly, and make sure that they're harmonizing AI requirements across different agencies, hiring more talent, a whole bunch of stuff. And most relevant for today's conversation, manage risks from the use of AI. So, this includes a number of things. Most importantly, it talks about what to do when AI is rights impacting. So, this means AI whose output serves as a principal basis for a decision or action concerning a specific individual or entity that has a legal, material, binding, or similarly significant effect on that individual or entity's civil rights, civil liberties, or privacy. That has a significant effect on that individual's or entity's equal opportunities, including equitable access to education. If it has a significant effect on that individual's access to or ability to apply for critical government resources or services. So there really is a focus here on making sure that certain very sensitive uses that pose greater risks have additional guardrails put on them. And the memo specifically includes a number of purposes where they presume that doing that thing will impact someone's rights, will be a rights impacting AI. Specifically, it says that in education contexts, detecting student cheating or plagiarism, influencing an admissions process, monitoring students online or in virtual reality, projecting student progress or outcomes, recommending disciplinary interventions, determining access to educational resources or programs, determining eligibility for student aid or federal education, or facilitating surveillance, whether online or in person. All of these are purposes presumed to be rights impacting. Now, you may be asking, how many of these things does the Department of Education or other federal agencies actually do? And that's an important question. It feels evident, to me at least, that by saying that these educational purposes are rights impacting, the federal government is seeking not just to govern what federal agencies are doing, but to influence what is happening outside of the federal agencies and pushing local and state governments towards also considering these purposes in the education context to be rights impacting and therefore require more guardrails. So, what do those guardrails look like? In the OMB memo, they include an AI impact assessment. So, agencies have to document the intended purpose for the AI and its expected benefit, potential risks, and the quality and appropriateness of the relevant data. It also requires testing of the AI for performance in the real world context, independent evaluation of AI, and a requirement that you continue monitoring it. This includes regularly evaluating risks, mitigating any emerging risks, ensuring adequate human training and assessment, providing additional human oversight, intervention, and accountability, and providing public notice and plain language documentation. This is also required before initiating use of new or existing rights impacting AI. So as of December 1st, 2024, or no later than December 1st, 2024, agencies have to follow these minimum practices for AI that is safety impacting or rights impacting. So again, identifying and assessing AI's impact on equity and fairness, mitigating algorithmic discrimination, consulting and incorporating feedback from affected communities into the public, conducting ongoing monitoring and mitigation for AI enabled discrimination, notifying affected individuals, maintaining human consideration and remedy processes, and maintaining options to opt out for AI enabled decisions. OMB also noted that there are risks related to AI in the federal procurement process and has actually asked for comments on how AI should be governed within that federal procurement process. So, that is a ton of information, and you can see that we are running to keep up with everything that is coming up, with more and more things happening every day. So, I said, and as I promised, I will make sure that these slides are sent out and the recording. Always happy to answer questions now or later on these various issues. This is very tricky to follow, even for someone who works on these issues full time. And so we want to be supportive to you, both from AASA's Student and Child Privacy Center and from Public Interest Privacy Center, in order to provide you with information and resources and connect you with whatever you need so you can do your day to day work without all of this floating as a black cloud over everything else you're doing. You should be able to focus on educating kids. And we hope that the information provided today helps a little bit to put all of this in context. So, with that, today's presentation is done. Happy to take questions from anyone. But thank you so much to everyone for coming. We'll wait a couple minutes, see if there are any questions that are put in our Q&A. Not seeing any. Thank you all so much for attending. We hope this was useful. If it could have been more useful, let us know how. We'll continue to update on all of these issues as things continue to evolve. Thank you so much.